Let's pray. Heavenly Father, once again I thank you that so many people have bravely continued this study of Leviticus. I pray, Lord, as always, that you'll repay their effort with some insight that you give them tonight. Something about the word that we read, that we find in the word that we read, that builds them up, edifies them, makes them love you more, and makes it easier for them to obey you and to serve you. I pray the same for myself. Please do help me tonight to do better than I did last week. I think I have my presentation this week. Lord, please breathe life into our study and help us to see your face. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, so we're continuing our study of the Old Testament book of Leviticus. Last week we began chapter 25, reading the first 22 verses, but I had some problem with my slides, which made the class not very good, I think. So tonight we'll cover all of chapter 25, and we'll briefly touch on, but not reread, all of the first 22 verses which we read last time. Again, I remind us at the beginning of where we are in the book of Leviticus. It's probably good enough for tonight just to remind you that the first 16 chapters of Leviticus, as outlined on the slide, collectively have to do with what you might call religious practices. What are the ways in which Yahweh may be properly worshipped by his people? The second main part of Leviticus begins at chapter 17 and continues through to chapter 26, which has to do with holy living by the children of Israel, or sometimes called the Holiness Code. And then the last chapter, chapter 27, is a kind of an appendix to the whole thing that has to do with tithes and offerings. We are still in the second to the last dot on the slide, the Holiness Code, the section that describes holy living. And indeed, we're near the end of that section. 2 weeks ago, we completed chapter 24, and as you'll hopefully remember, it began with some timely instructions about maintaining lamps and bread in the tabernacle. Then that was interrupted by a story, a narrative, about two men who got into a fight in Israel. One of them, whose father was Egyptian, blasphemed the name of the Lord. Not knowing what to do, the people held that man until they could receive instructions from God through Moses. God's instructions were that the man would be put to death for having blasphemed the name of God. And this established a really frightening precedent, which has affected the reading of the Bible by the Jews for all time. It's very important to not blaspheme the name of God, even by accident. Having established this ruling, God continued to speak. So verses 15 through 22 of chapter 24 were about some other laws on lesser matters. And as I have mentioned before, the laws that are laid out in chapter 24 are presented in a very definite literary structure called chiasm. And here finally I have a PowerPoint slide that will diagram what I mean when I speak of that. Perhaps most of you have already caught on to this, but please do notice that verses 16 and 23, the first and the last verse in the chiasm, both have to do with the punishment by death of blasphemy. Verse 17 and the latter part of verse 21 both have to do with murder being punishable by death. Verse 18 and the first part of verse 21 both have to do with replacing an animal if you kill it with an animal of equivalent value. And finally, verses 19 and 20 in the middle are what's often referred to as lex talionis, that is, laws for proportional response, that the punishment would fit the crime, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so forth. And in case of this particular chiasm in chapter 24, there's very little doubt we can have that it's an intentional literary structure. That is to say, the author organized his thoughts in this structure intentionally. This couldn't really happen by random, and such structures are found often in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. And what it does is it has the effect of tying all of this material together. Two references to blasphemy like that, all by themselves, would be called by the people who study, text an incluso. Two similar things catching everything in the middle. But here we have a series of them, one inside the other, like one of those Russian dolls where you keep taking off and you find another one inside. And the effect of this structure, you can wonder about, but basically it has the effect of focusing attention on and providing context for the middle term, the term that's in the middle of the chiasm. In this case, verses 19 and 20, which have to do with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and so forth. And because of this structure, and because this discussion of law centered on an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is precipitated by the narrative that precedes it, I think it's fair to say that the author of all of chapter 24, this focal point, the main theme of chapter 24 is lex talionis, that is, that every crime should receive an appropriate punishment, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on. So the fact that in the book of Leviticus, here we're reading this principle of law, lex talionis, places Israel among a group of other nations, ancient nations in the Middle East, who had similar laws. The idea that a civilization has laws that assure that there's a proper punishment for each crime may be necessary to have any sort of lasting civilization at all. I think in every civilization that would last, you'd have to have some sort of justice of this kind. I've read that in Israel, it was one of the few nations, particularly in ancient times, that would apply this rule of law to all people within the nation, high and low, free and servant, rich and poor. In most other nations, that would have applied only to powerful people or to free people, but not to slaves or to servants or to poor people. But in Israel, it applied to everyone. That's a step forward. I've heard that in Israel, as in a lot of these other civilizations, it's possible to provide compensation in lieu of punishment. So just take, for example, here, and this is part of the context provided by this structure. If you kill somebody's animal, the principle of eye for eye, tooth for tooth sort of boldly applied would be say, okay, they'll kill your animal. But that doesn't really help anything, right? It's much better for the person who's damaged, whose animal has been killed, to have you compensate them for the loss of their animal. Likewise, in the middle term, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. If you knock out my tooth, I'd really rather not just knock out your tooth. I'd rather have you compensate me for the loss of a tooth. And in fact, in almost every civilization, every society where they had laws assuring just punishment, it would be possible to substitute compensation for retribution. It was true in Israel for sure, true in other societies, but there are exceptions. So in case here we see the exceptions through the structure, there's no way that you can compensate a dead person. And so if somebody murders you, the only just punishment according to this way of thinking is capital punishment, which is a thought which survives well into the 21st century in our world. If it's premeditated murder, actual murder, then the punishment, many people would say, should be death. And blasphemy, Leviticus would have us understand, is even worse than murder. It's worse than that. There's no way you can compensate God for blaspheming his name. So the punishment for that is also not something that you can turn aside. But with those two exceptions, at least, the principle being put forward here is that there should be justice. So that's why I made this slide. I love this slide. I used it once before, and I want to use it one more time before we get out of Leviticus. I spent a long time making this slide. And the reason why I made this slide is I want to convey to you the positive aspects of lex talionis. We read eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and we think that that's some grisly, awful thing. But in fact, it's not. It's precisely the kind of justice that's demanded by Bushido or the Code of the West or any civilization where there's a rule of law. Justice, like God, should be no respecter of persons. The symbol of justice there, she's blind because justice should be the same regardless of who it is. The scales are balanced because justice should be the same no matter who it is. She has a sword because in order to enforce justice, even for the poor and the powerless, it's necessary for the state to use power. You need to have an army. You need to have a police force. You need to have jails. You need to have the ability to enforce law. And you need to understand that lex talionis is aimed at punishing strong and evil criminals while protecting weak and innocent victims. Powerful people can defend themselves. Weak people can't. And so the purpose of having laws in a civilization is, first of all, to punish the weak and the powerless from being the victims of the strong and the powerful. But also, lex talionis is protecting weak and poor criminals against being punished excessively for their crimes. You can imagine in the Middle Ages, you might have made a slight offense to the king or some lord of the manor, and they cut off your head or cut off your hand or something like that. Lex talionis doesn't allow that either. It has to be fair. It has to be balanced. It has to be proportional. And so in Israel, we're made to understand by chapter 24. In Israel, the state stands behind everyone equally, which means the state stands especially behind the weak who couldn't have protected themselves without the intervention of the state. Such is the kingdom of God, at least. There's equal protection under the law. So I'll leave chapter 24 behind us now and keep moving on through chapter 25, but I think that's a really key point to pick up from our study of Leviticus. That's part of what God is trying to convey in chapter 24. Now, I noticed this before, and I'm going to notice it again, that chapter 24, which I was just talking about lex talionis, about justice in Israel, is trapped between chapter 23 and the first part of chapter 25, both of which have to do with calendars. Chapter 23, if you remember, is about the weekly observance of the Sabbath and the yearly observance of the festivals, spring and fall. The first part of chapter 25, which we read into last week, is about the extended calendar. Once every 7 years, there will be a Sabbath year, a sabbatical year. And once every seven times 7, once every 49 or 50 years, there will be a Jubilee year. All of these are describing days of rest and remembrance and reverence and fellowship and celebration of God to be perpetuated day by day, week by week, year by year, 7 years by 7 years, 50 years by 50 years, forever, the way Leviticus is written. And I just noticed that the principle of chiasm, which I am sure that we see in chapter 24, you might ask yourself, and I think some literary critics do, are we looking at another one here? Is there a chiasm within a chiasm? Chapter 24 kind of showcased lex talionis. Here the calendar sections are trapping the legal section. Are we being told that these things are supposed to be taken together and understood together? I'm less clear on that from a literary point of view, but I think it doesn't much matter, because whether it's an intentional structure or not, it has the effect of causing us, or me at least, to read about basic justice in Israel within the context of Sabbath rest and holy remembrance and fellowship and celebration of things that are represented by the calendar material that precedes and follows it. In other words, the nation of Israel is not only a nation like Babylon and others, that maintain some basic rules of law and order. Theirs might have been better, but that's not the main point. It's not just that Israel applied justice to all of the people rather than just to the rich people. The main thing about Israel is that Israel is the primary benefit of God's grace. They're God's chosen people. So Israel is both a theocracy, that is a nation ruled by God and by things religious. The identity of Israel is Yahweh. He's at the center of it, physically and emotionally and spiritually and every other way. But it's also a society which, in addition to being a theocracy, has basic justice, where the powerful and the weak and the rich and the poor all are entitled to the same justice under the law. And all of those ideas are kind of held together here in chapters 23 through the first part of chapter 25. And I think there's lessons here for Japan and the United States and other modern countries as well. How could there be an unjust theocracy? If you want to claim that your nation is a Christian nation or a Muslim nation or whatever, Japan doesn't really claim that. But countries that do claim to have a religious, a relationship to God must surely be just, or something's out of whack. And Leviticus is telling us, at least as an ideal, Israel was supposed to be both just and worshipful. Okay, so that's kind of all I'll say about that. Now, last week we did read the beginning part of 25, and we're not going to read it again, but what I'll do is I'll just put up the slides that we had up last week and paraphrase or summarize what we read. So, chapter 25, in the first 7 verses, after the usual introductory material about announcing God's speech from Mount Sinai in this case, then God goes on through Moses to proclaim a Sabbath year. And in a nutshell, what that means, and you can read it for yourself, or if you were here last week, we read it already, is that after they enter the promised land, this is a law for the future. They're still camped outside Egypt, at Sinai, but God says, when you get to the promised land, then here's what you're going to do. You're going to do ordinary agricultural work, plant and harvest, plant and harvest, plant and harvest for 6 years in a row. And then in the 7th year, you will do no agricultural work. You'll neither harvest nor plant. The 7th year will be an absolute rest year for you and for the land that I'm going to give you. All the people, including visitors and even wild animals, are mentioned. It's okay to go ahead and eat what comes up naturally from the fields and from the forest, but you're not going to be planting or sowing or reaping or storing or buying or selling grain or olives or figs or anything. You're just going to live off of the land. And then at the start of the next cycle, which would be year 8 or year 1, if you're counting in cycles of 7, you'll start planting and harvesting again in the usual way. But God says, if you're worried you won't have enough to eat from taking a year off, don't worry, he says, because I'm going to make enough harvest in the 6th year that you'll still be eating from the produce of the 6th year in the 8th year when you're back into your normal agricultural cycle again. And I submit to you that if and wherever the Jews actually did this, and it's not so clear how often they did do it, but there's some evidence that parts of Israel for parts of history actually tried to observe this concept of the Sabbath year. Wherever they were doing that, they would have been demonstrating tremendous faith in God. I mean, they're basically saying, we won't harvest anything this year because God has promised to feed us. And it would have been a real picture of a faithful people. That's the concept of the Sabbath year that we read about in the first 7 verses of chapter 25. And then the next thing we read about in verses 8 through 22 last week was what's called the Jubilee. And probably it's best to understand that the Jubilee happens on every 7th Sabbath year. So you have Sabbath year, Sabbath year, Sabbath year, Sabbath years for 7 times. When you get to the 7th Sabbath year, which will be the 49th year counting that way, you observe a Jubilee, and the Jubilee is the 7th Sabbath year. Some people think there's an extra year, like the 50th year is after the 7th Sabbath year. Nobody really knows, and it doesn't really matter, because the thing that's important here is what's represented by the idea. And we'll be speaking more about this tonight, because the continued reading is more about the things that relate to the Jubilee year. Just the one thing that we read already is that in the year of Jubilee, the main thing that's going on in addition to what happens on a normal Sabbath year is anybody who had sold land since the last Jubilee, or anybody who had sold themselves into indentured servitude or to a foreign slave owner, as we'll read tonight, is in the Jubilee year set free. The slaves are set free. The prisoners are set free. The land returns back to the person or to the clan that originally owned it. Everything goes back. And the reason God says is because it belongs to me. I took you guys out of slavery in Egypt. I'm going to give you a land, but I still own the land, and I still own the people. The promised land is owned by Yahweh. The chosen people are owned by Yahweh. You have a lot of freedom to do what you want to do, including buying and selling your land and yourself, but it's not going to stick any longer than 7 times 7 is the Jubilee year, in which case it'll all come back to my original gifting, of land. That's the concept that we have here in front of us. We'll talk more about that in a second. What I want to do, though, before digging into this in more detail and continued reading, is come back and finish sort of my introduction regarding structure. So tonight we'll finish chapter 25. And chapter 25 has to do, in my way of thinking, with justice and redemption and grace, the things that happen in a Jubilee year when people who own land give it back to the original owner, but at the fair price. People who were slaves or servants are redeemed and set free. We see justice and God's grace all mingled together in the concept of a Jubilee year. And this sort of continues and expands the thoughts that were already present in the first part of chapter 25. So you kind of get a picture of what it will look like if justice is mixed together with grace and redemption in a sort of a perfect chosen nation of God. Then next week, we're going to read chapter 26, which is about blessings and curses. Basically, the idea is people who abide by the principles that have gone before will be blessed and will live in the land in a blessed way. People who ignore the principles that went before, I think going all the way back to the beginning of Leviticus, I'll argue, will be cursed. You see the same logic in Deuteronomy where God speaks of blessings and curses. And it's really the same for us. The nuance may be a bit different in the New Testament, but those of us who follow Christ are called to obey Him, and to disobey is worse for us than to obey, because obedience is accompanied by all kinds of blessings. They have the same sort of environment in some ways that we do. Okay, so to wrap up my introduction then, I think I'm running on my time, is I've tried to show how I see a structure that connects chapter 23 through the first part of chapter 25. Basically, the text about calendars sort of connects itself thematically. It traps the text which is focused on the law of sort of lex talionis, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. That material all sort of hangs together. And it tells you that Israel is a land which is just, and also a land which is centered on the worship and remembrance of Yahweh and fellowship among His chosen people. So it's a society which is intrinsically theocratic, but also just and equitable. And then, as we noticed last week, chapter 25, from the first verse till chapter 26 to the last verse, is all one long speech of God. Remember last week I touched on this. It says in there in the beginning, a fresh speech of God begins. It's emphasized here in this long last speech of God that it's from Sinai. The last verse of chapter 26 concludes all of that with some words that sort of look all the way back to verse 1 of chapter 25, or maybe even back to the beginning of Leviticus. And then those two things share chapter 25, verses 1 through 22, because it's part of both structures. So in some sense, chapter 25, verses 1 through 22 are kind of a hinge on which all of those things hang together. And you're coming into the tail end of Leviticus with a sort of crescendo that seems to hang together and make sense to me the more I look at it. So the overall message is something like this. God says, remember me in your daily offerings, in your weekly Sabbaths, in your annual festivals, in your Sabbath years, in your Jubilee years. And while you're at it, God says, be just. especially in protecting the rights of the weak who have no power to protect themselves. And finally, with what we're going to read tonight, God says, and don't have a society where all of the land and all of the power accumulate into the hands of a few people. The people belong to me. The land belongs to me. It's not my intention, says God, that it's all going to go to some people. You can buy and you can sell, but you always have to be able to redeem among yourselves. And if you don't come to an equitable balance, every 50 years it's reset back to God's original, disposition. And then chapter 26 will say, if you can do all of that, you'll live a life of blessedness. And if you can't, then there will be a curse. And one of the curses listed in chapter 26 is you'll be kicked out of the land, which belongs to God. And we know the history that comes, right? We studied in here the minor prophets recently. The prophets talk and talk and talk and warn and warn and warn. Israel doesn't do these things. 10 tribes are completely lost to the Assyrians. Later, 2 tribes go to exile in Babylon. Their land is taken away. Their nation is taken away. They come back from exile in Babylon, a fragment of their former self. Some centuries go by, then they're occupied by Rome. Really, they failed to do these things. That's what the Bible history is telling us. They failed to do what God told them to do. And the result has been that the nation finally fell down and finally was taken away. 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem was torn down. It's over. This whole promise was frustrated by their lack of obedience. And about the time that became clear is when Christ came, and it could be seen what the real fulfillment of all of this would be. Okay, that's kind of the context of what we're doing. Okay, so tonight we read on then, starting in verse 23. Steve, could you please read chapter 25, verse 23 through 34?
Okay. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it, and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. If a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, he may redeem it within a year of its sale. For a full year he shall have the right of redemption. If it is not redeemed within a full year, then the house in the walled city shall belong in perpetuity to the buyer throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. But the houses of the villages that have no wall around them shall be classified with the fields of the land. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released in the Jubilee. As for the cities of the Levites may redeem at any time the houses in the cities they possess. And if one of the Levites exercises his right of redemption, then the house that was sold in a city they possessed shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses in the cities of the Levites are their possession among the people of Israel. But the fields of pasture land belonging to their cities may not be sold, for that is their possession forever.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
So Jubilee or Jubilee, both, that which is the stress? The first part
How to pronounce the word, do you mean?
Yeah, or how to pronounce that jubilee or jubilee. When I listen to that Steve, the two ways.
Sorry about that. Jubilee. Jubilee.
Lee
Jubilee.
is stress, not a Jew.
Jubilee. That's the proper sound. Sometimes I stress a different sound. I apologize.
Oh, so jubilee.
Jubilee.
How do you pronounce it?
Jubilee.
Jubilee.
Is it the matching? Jubilee, Jubilee, Jubilee. Jubilee.
We do the best we can.
Yeah, okay.
It's as distinct from Gentile belief.
Yeah, you can ask the one for that.
I saw something on the internet the other day that said there's Jiu-Jitsu. They will win. So, yeah. So I think that, especially for those of you who have read around Exodus and the rest of the Old Testament a little bit, what Steve just read is mostly self-explanatory. So rather than go through it in order, verse by verse, let me try to say it in a different order, in a different way, the same thing. So verse 23, I think, is kind of the key, maybe, to understanding what's going on here. God says, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You are strangers and sojourners with me." Right? So God has taken these people out of slavery less than 2 years before the time of Leviticus. They're still at Sinai in the first month of the second year following the Exodus from Egypt. God has told them, "I'm going to take you slaves someplace, and I'm going to give you land that you can live in and that you can use. But I'm the owner of the land," God says. And later it'll become clear God reckons he's the owner of the people also. And if you read the whole Bible, you'll basically understand God understands everything belongs to God. I mean, we do understand that. God made everything and God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Everything belongs to God. And so since everything belongs to him, he can decide if he's going to give you something, how you can use it. I mean, what are the limits and rules for how you can use it. And so that's a kind of principle behind all of this here. And right now, God is asserting his sovereignty, as you hear people say, his ownership of both the land and of the people in regard to how they can use the land and some limits on how they can use the land. And he says to them, it's very interesting to me, you're visitors in the land. You're sojourners in the land. In other words, I, the landowner, can let you visit or I can kick you out, right? And that's really what's at risk here. As he gives them the promised land and his rules and his instructions, and later he sends his prophets, and the prophets warn, turn back to God or else you'll be turned out of the land. That's what's behind all of this here. If they can't behave the way that they're supposed to as visitors in his land, then God will send them elsewhere, and that's indeed what finally does happen. Right? So it's easiest to understand this chapter if you understand as a starting point that there's an initial distribution of land. So God takes the territory of the promised land and divides it among the tribes of Israel. And in fact, you'll know, probably most of you, that's what happens. When they enter the promised land, the land is divided among the tribes of Israel. The different tribes and the clans of the tribes all are assigned different portions of the land. And that's supposed to be a sort of perpetual gifting to each of the tribes. It goes back to the promise made to Jacob, who's also named Israel. The promise went to his 12 sons. They come into the promised land, and the land promise is divided among the sons of Jacob. And it's supposed to be a promise that lasts, forever, so long as they'll obey God and obey him. And the one exception is the tribe of Levites, the descendants of Levi, because they're given no land, because their job is to take care of the tabernacle and later the temple. And so they live off of the offerings that the people make, as we've been studying throughout Leviticus. They live off the food offerings and the grain offerings and the other offerings people make. And also, there will be some cities within the land which are set aside for the descendants of Levi where they can live, as are discussed here, in some pasture land connected to those cities. But basically, Levites don't get a share in the land, which is why they get a share in the offerings made to God. Okay, so the whole thing Steve just read will kind of make logically more sense if you start out with the idea that everybody has been assigned by God their own share of the land. And God says to them, I've given you this land. Now you can use it however you want to. Oh, I guess there are some rules God has given them about, for example, the Sabbath year and like that. I mean, there are rules they have to follow, but they have some freedom in how they can use the land that God has given them. And we find out here they can even sell it if they want to, which would not necessarily have been obvious. When God handed out the land, he might have said, just leave things as they are. But God imagines that there may be reasons why they would sell land to one another. God gives them that freedom, but the limitation God imposes on them is you can't give up your land forever. So if I have the control of my land and I go to one of you and I say, here, I'm going to give you the use of my land and you give me money or goats or cows or whatever it is you're going to give me, I can do that, but there's two limits at least. The term of this agreement can't be forever. The maximum term is 50 years because at the next Jubilee, the land is coming back to me. And the other condition is that there should always be attached to this transaction the possibility that I could redeem my land even before the Jubilee. So I say, okay, here, I'll give you the land, you give me money. I change my mind later, or I make some money later, I want to get my land back. I can come to you with cash or something else and buy my land back. And the math will be according to how many years are left remaining for the Jubilee. So that's what's going on here. Those of you who are more commercially minded, you might say, well, you can't ever really sell land. You can only do long-term leases, and the maximum term on the lease would be 50 years, and there'd have to be a buyback option on the lease. They have this in their minds. Okay? So nobody can be permanently cut off from the land. And that rule is easiest to understand in terms of landholders, like farmers, for example. But then it goes into some details in what Steve just read. And it says the rule applies to land, but it also applies to houses out in villages that have no walls. So like here, for example, you have farmland with a farmhouse. The rule that I just described would apply. You could sell your land and you could sell the house on it. But the rules about redemption and Jubilee year and all of that would apply to all of that property. It also applies to houses of Levites in the cities of the Levites. So Levites only can have a house in the city of the Levites. Just like a farmer who sells his land, the Levite can sell his house in the city of Levites, but not forever. It's going to come back at least within 50 years, and he's going to have the right always to redeem his house in the meantime. And he says it also applies to houses in walled cities, but only for 1 year. So if I have a mansion in a kind of mansion, I don't know if it's inside Jerusalem or some walled city, I can sell it to you, and I have to be able to redeem it for 1 year. But if I don't redeem it within 1 year, then it's yours now. It doesn't come back on the Jubilee year. And to finish this whole thought, what Steve read, the only thing that you can never sell at all is the pasture land in a Levite city. Although I could easily imagine the Jews would come up with rental contracts that would get them to the same place, right? And so God is expecting his people to be businessmen and traders and to be able to do lots of stuff that they want to do. Some will become rich, some will become poor, some will have to sell their land. all of those things God imagines will happen. It's not a world where there's no change or no commerce or no trading. But in the world that God commands them to have, it's a world where nobody can be cut off from their inheritance in the land for very long. Not them, not their children. It's not like in the United States or probably Japan or other countries, for example, where through inheritance and other things, some family could get richer and richer and richer and richer year after year until all of the land in Israel belongs to somebody, or finally he impoverishes everyone to the point where they sell themselves as servants or whatever, and finally you have a king who owns all of the people and all of the land because he was like stronger than everyone else. It can't happen in God's country if people are listening to God. And if they don't, he's going to kick them out, he says. Right? So that's what's happening here in verses 23 through 34. Does anybody have a question or comment about that?
3節から34節はそういうことが今読んだ通りに書かれています。
That time about the world city, there are many world
At the time of that we're reading, there's none because they're still camped at Mount Sinai and they haven't entered the Promised Land. Later there will be Jerusalem and Jericho and some other cities in the northern and southern kingdom. There will be. And I think there will be some cities that are understood to be cities of the Levites. But the one thing that, and it answers some of your questions that you have about Jubilee and so forth, the thing we have to remember, and you'll remember if you were here when we studied the Minor Prophets, right, is that almost from the beginning when the people say that they want a king, and David and his son Solomon and the whole cascade of kings fall into sin, and there's division in the kingdom, and the northern tribes go away. There's not very much history where God's rules are obeyed by them, and they suffer because they disobey God's rules. I was thinking this morning on the train, when God said to Adam and Eve, "Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil," I don't think God was surprised when they ate from that tree. And when God told these people, "Here's how you should live in order to live in a blessed life in the land that I'll show you," I don't think God's surprised that they fell down into every kind of sin. And sure, the prophets knew it was going to happen ahead of time, right? They called and they called and they called. And so you ask me, why didn't Jesus talk about Jubilees or something like that? There probably weren't ever any or very many ever, Jubilee years in the history of Israel, because the concept was announced here at Sinai. But there was never a stable pattern in the land, until shortly after they got into the land, the Assyrians came and wiped out the northern kingdom, the Babylonians kept the southern tribe. They came back pretty soon later, the Romans are in charge. There's never been an actual environment in which these things could be systematically tried. And I looked on the computer also, the word Jubilee only appears in Leviticus and one time in Numbers. And in Numbers, they're just talking about inheritance rules. So nobody in the New Testament ever mentioned Jubilees explicitly by that name. And none of the Old Testament prophets either. We can see the idea of it in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and in Jesus, I think, and in things that are said. The idea of setting the prisoners free, the idea of Jubilee is present, but not the institution of Jubilee the way it's laid out here. I don't think it's not something we can read about outside of Leviticus except as a concept, indirectly. Okay, Steve, you want to hit 35 through 46?
35 through 46, all right? If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly.
Okay, so again, I think if you quietly read through this, it's not that hard to understand. There's some things in here that will be shocking to some people in modern times. And again, I think I'm going to try to explain it rather than go through verse by verse just in the interest of time. And in this case, it's easier for me to think about it upside down. So let me explain it this way. Background for all of this is the fact that slavery did exist in that time and in that place. I think it was very common then. After all, Israel had been slaves in Egypt for 430 years. They only got out less than 2 years before this discussion happened. So to them, slavery is they were slaves in Egypt longer than the United States of America has been a country. So to them, slavery was just something that there was, right? And they weren't the only people who had been slaves in Egypt or the only people who had been slaves in the nations around there. So slavery is probably more common and less shocking to them than it is to us in modern times. Not only that, they're going to be slaves again in Babylon, and the Assyrians will take 10 tribes away. So, I mean, their days as slaves are not over yet. And arguably, during World War II in Nazi Germany, they were slaves again. I mean, slavery is something that the Jews have experienced in various forms over all the years. So slavery exists as a background to all of this. In verses 44 through 46a, God expressly permits Israelites to own slaves from other nations, right? As Steve just read. It's okay for Israelites to buy and sell or even inherit from their parents when they die, and like that, slaves, people as property, is something that the Israelites could do so long as the slaves in question were not Israelites. So make of that what you will, but that was the reality of the world that they lived in, and God wasn't saying, with the property transactions in the previous reading or with respect to slavery here, now, or later when the Apostle Paul writes in the New Testament, none of the Bible is saying you should go out and overturn, the institutions of slavery or other things that you see in the societies of the world you live in. That's part of was part of their reality. What God is doing here, though, is he's saying that the rules are different when the person who's the servant or the slave is an Israelite. So verses 39 through 43 and 46b also permits poor Israelites to sell themselves to Israelites. But in this case, the rule is different. They can only sell themselves until the Jubilee year at a maximum. And the poor brother who sells himself to another Jew as a slave or a servant cannot be mistreated. In fact, the text says you shall not treat him as a slave. He should be treated as a servant, right? So imagine this, a guy is poor and starving to death and he has no options. And he goes to his fellow Jew and he says, I'm poor and I'm starving to death and I have no options. Could I work for you and will you pay me? It could be to the benefit of both of them, and provided they'll listen to the rules of Yahweh, they won't be abused, they won't be treated like a slave, it won't be forever, and they can always redeem themselves if they or one of their relatives can come up with the cash. And so it's what I think in the early days of the United States they would have called an indentured servant, or in England also. I think the Western cultures have that. Kids from poor families who don't have any prospects may become an indentured servant of some wealthy merchant or silversmith or blacksmith or something to learn a trade or to work or whatever, because that's the best thing that they can find to do. So here we see that's possible also. But the beginning part of this, verses 35 through 37, says that before that, if you're living your life and you look and beside you is your brother, a fellow Israelite, and he's poor, then you're supposed to let him live among you. You don't push him away because he's poor. And you have to feed him and treat him well, like you're also supposed to treat people who are visiting in Israel. So a poor Israelite is supposed to be treated as well as a poor visitor who needs food and support and a place to live. And not only that, it says here, don't loan him money and charge interest, and don't give him food at a profit, right? Which are things that happen a lot of times in human history. In the United States, it used to be people would hire poor people to work in mining, for example, in coal mines or whatever. They'd work all day, they'd make some money, they'd come out, they'd need to buy something and be hungry, and they'd say, we have a company store. And so they'd go to the company store and spend all of their money and still need more, so the company would loan them money at interest, and finally they'd be slaves because they owed so much money to the company store that they had to work for the rest of their life in the mine, and they could never really be free, right? I guess there was stuff like that in Japan at various points in history too. And so God is saying, he's not saying that you can't go to your brother and ask to be his servant if that's what you need to do to survive. But he is saying if you're an Israelite, you have a right to expect fair treatment. A poor person has a right to expect food and other support without interest or without price gouging, because why? The principle is the same. God says, I took you guys out of slavery. The land belongs to me. You belong to me. How dare you, turn to your brother and charge them too much for food or lend them money at interest or make them your slave. You can't do that. They belong to me. Right, so that's what we read in verses 35 through 46. And by the way, it's not at all clear whether this passage prohibits lending at interest in business. Probably not. This is probably just talking about lending money at interest in case of a poor person who's on the edge and needs to borrow money. Some people have tried to apply this passage to bank loans for commercial, just normal commercial lending, and that's probably not what it's talking about. Although a lot of Islamic law goes that way. Okay. All right. 5 minutes and one last reading. Steve, from page 40, verses 47 through 55.
Okay, 47 through 55 reads, If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. He shall calculate with his buyer from the year when he sold himself to him until the year of Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall vary with the number of years. The time he was with the owner shall be rated as the time of a hired worker. If there are still many years left, he shall pay proportionately for his redemption some of his sale price. If there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, he shall calculate and pay for his redemption in proportion to his years of service. He shall treat him as a worker hired year by year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Okay, so again, fairly self-explanatory. Before this, we've read that a foreigner could become a slave of an Israelite. We've also read that an Israelite may become an indentured servant, but not exactly a slave of another Israelite. So there remains the question whether an Israelite can become the slave or servant of a foreigner in Israel, which is what the text addresses that Steve just read. And please note, what we're talking about is things that happen within the promised land, within the nation of Israel, within the jurisdiction of Israel. We're not talking about what may happen in Egypt or elsewhere in Mesopotamia or whatever. Right now we're talking about in the land of promise where they will come to live. It's obviously imaginable that there could be visitors among them, foreigners who would become rich, and Israelites would give themselves to them as servants or slaves, and they're wondering how would that work. And the answer given in verses 47 through 55 is basically that foreigners need to treat their Israelite servants the same as these servants would be treated by Israelite masters. So you can't treat your Israelite servants worse because you're a foreigner. You have to treat them the same as if you were an Israelite. For example, the maximum term could only be until the next Jubilee. They should always be able to redeem themselves if they or their family could produce the cash. They couldn't be mistreated. And again, the reason is because it's impossible to sell an Israelite to a foreigner because they belong to God. God won't stand for that. It's God's property. No foreigner could keep them. So in summary of all of the rules on how people are treated, there's basically no slavery allowed in Israel where the children of Israel are concerned. You can be an indentured servant for a limited amount of time with fair treatment, but you can never really become a slave, even with a foreign owner, so long as you're in Israel, because you belong to God. And the same kind of deal with the land. You can buy and you can sell and all of that and redeem whatever, but you can never give up your birthright. Always your land is going to come back to you in the Jubilee year. And no, even though the Jubilee was probably rarely had a chance to be practiced in the fullness that it's described here, and even the Sabbath years probably only happened partially in some places for some of the centuries that the Bible looks at. The principles that are laid out here are strong, I think, and we understand the heart of God and the intent of God about how people should be treated, about how his relationship with his people and with the things that he gives to them. And a lot of them are even applicable to us, how we treat poor people and how we treat people who need work. Just because somebody is really hungry and they need a job and they come to you and you say, okay, I'll give you a job, it doesn't give you the right to treat them badly or to abuse them because they have no choice. You have to be careful because we know that God isn't like that, right? God has a different idea. And so next week, as I said in the introduction, when we get to chapter 26, we'll see the blessings and the curses that God holds out to them. If you'll do things my way, you'll live long in the land and you'll be blessed. If you try to do things in this world's way, then there'll be a problem and you may have to be kicked out of the land, which we know because we know the end of the story is basically what happens to them. before you guys go away, because some of you are different than were here last week, we are
今スクリーンで出てる
2
次は
weeks
どうしますかっていうことが書かれて
2 weeks or so away from being finished with Leviticus. And I'm just wondering, how many people would like to continue the Tuesday evening Bible study?
火曜日のバイブルスタディを続けたい方はどのぐらいいらっしゃいますかって
See,
聞いてるんです
my wife is the same way. Put up your hand.
Because he didn't listen to
Okay. And okay, thank you. And could I understand, would everybody agree that it's better to move back into the New Testament next time?
新約聖書に移りたいと皆さん思ってますか
She's not sure.
新約聖書の方がいいと
I don't care, but I feel like Leviticus is really Old Testament.
ものすごい旧約聖書
And I'm afraid we don't want to get cut off from Jesus by accident for too long. So it might be better to,
イエス直接にそのイエス様
not that that should be the result of reading the Old Testament, but I just feel like it would be better to do the New Testament. So what do you think would be good? Here's some ideas that I've had for you can think about. So as you, some of you may or may not know, the author of Luke and the author of Acts are the same person. It used to be in the early days of the church, that was one book. And then at some point they broke it into 2 pieces. But both Luke and Acts are said to have been written by Luke. And so the interesting thing about that is it lets you go from the birth of Jesus all the way through to the life of the apostles out into the time, so that's one interesting study. It's pretty long. It's probably Luke and Acts together must be like a third of the New Testament or something, but that's one idea. 1st and 2nd Corinthians is another idea. That's my favorite idea, but just the reason why is because I've taught 1 Corinthians before, and I think that I could do better this time. And I think it has a lot to say about resurrection of the dead, which is a concept that New Testament Christians don't probably understand well enough, and so it'd be a good opportunity to study that and some other things for the people who are interested. Also, women in ministry, speaking in tongues. There's a lot of controversial subjects that make for a kind of, fun class if people don't go crazy on me. Another possibility would be the so-called pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which are epistles written to explain what pastors and other people who serve in church should be like, written by Paul to Timothy and Titus. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. 1st Thessalonians, a lot of people say, was the very first letter written by Paul, so it's a kind of an early glimpse into Paul's thinking, and also has a lot to do with end times. 1st and 2nd Peter is, people don't study Peter all that often. We've actually studied 1st and 2nd Peter on Tuesday night years ago. The prison letters are Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon are all letters that Paul wrote supposedly while he was in prison. And they have a lot of similarities to each other, so that's a kind of a grouping, or Galatians, which is Galatians. So these are just to stimulate thoughts. Does anybody have any feelings that you could share? And we don't have to do clumps of them. We can just do one book too, if you just want to pick 1 Thessalonians or 1 Corinthians. Usually you do 2 Corinthians and 2 Thessalonians because you were doing first, and then you just go ahead and do the second one, but you don't have to.
だからテサロニケの手紙とコリント人への手紙を一緒のようなことが書いてある部分があるので、そういうふうに組み合わせることもできるかもしれません。
Yoji, do you have any idea?
ですからこの今書
Any
いた
preference?
新約聖書を今度次のテキストとしてどういうふうに勉強したいか、どこを勉強したいかっていう
Insuk,
そんな思いがあったら皆さん
do you have any preference? Huh? Just New Testament? Toko-san, you have any preference? Naoya, you're always here, so you and Kimura-san are always here, so you get a heavy vote.
ですから何か
So is Stephen Fumiko.
I don't have any preference.
None. Does anybody have anything up here they don't want to study? No, because you just studied it or something? What? Okay. We'll study the New Testament. Has anybody recently studied anything you want to cross off the list?
Well, if you combine Luke and Acts, it's going to be a year-long process. That's for sure.
It's long. It's a good study. The only thing I have against it is I've taught Acts 3 times before, and I really rather not teach it 4. But it's a good study, actually. I never taught Luke at the same time, though. You're right. It's probably too long. You'd be tired of Luke by the time you did Luke and Acts all together, maybe.
どう一つおいてるのは随分長くなりますよね。まとめて
Okay, I don't want to keep you. Yes, Steve?
So just for reference, because Hubik and I have a study with other Christians on Wednesday night. It's sort
で
of
水曜日の他のグル
interdenominational
ー
kind
プ
of
で
thing.
文子さん
But
と
we're
自
studying
分は
Acts
勉
right
強してるん
now.
ですけど
And we've recently studied Corinthians.
最近コリント人をと手紙を勉強したので他の
Okay.
自分個人でも他のやりたいなと思ってます。コリント人への手紙じゃなくて。
Anybody else? Yeah?
I think first with the Philippines is I think better because Philippines always talk about its Christian life.
で、フィリピンはクリスチャンの生活について書かれてますよね。
Okay, so I have Acts, definitely not, right? Because you're studying it now.
まあ、使徒教典じゃない方がいい。
Corinthians, probably not. You studied it pretty recently?
Very recently.
手紙もちょっとっていう人もいましたね。
And Acts we're studying right now.
Yeah, okay. And you say, so that's minus votes for Acts and Corinthians, plus vote for Philippians?
Philippines, yeah.
Anybody else have any other plus or minus
フィリピンの
votes?
手紙はまあクリスチャンの人たちの考え方を学ぶのにはいいかなっていう意見もあります。
Nothing? Huh? Thessalonians, plus vote for Thessalonians? If you have any further opinions or thoughts, you guys, will you please send me an email? And I'll try to come back next week with a more focused and hopefully concluding exercise on this. So thank you. That feedback is helpful.
Do we have the celebration for finishing the study of the Leviticus?
で、勉強し終わったので、
If-
お祝いをしますけど。
It's
It's just a sigh of relief.
it's always good for me if we do, because that gives me 1 week extra to get ready for the next one. But how many people want to have a celebration after we finish Leviticus?
What kind of that celebration? I want to have that every 1 or 2 weeks, no Bible study, just rest. So
Okay.
Sabbath.
Well, that's important because you do all the translation. So
For your preparation.
how much time do you want? 2 weeks?
2 weeks would be better. For me, just please ask others. 他の人はどうですか？私ちょっと休みたいんでっていうか、だから2週間ぐらいあったら嬉しいかなって思いますけど、他の人はどうですか？
Just for 1 week we have a party, small party.
じゃあ、1週間休みで1週間パーティーはどうですか？1回パーティーで1回休み。
So it sounds like we can get 1 week and 1 party. Do you need Do you need an extra week beside that? Yes?
It's okay.
Okay. Is there anybody studying the, some of you are studying the biblical counseling stuff, right?
クリスチャンのカウンセラーみたいな勉強をしたこと。
Toko-san, are you going to continue to study biblical counseling?
基づいたカウンセラー
Biblical
の
counseling?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to continue.
Don't they have some book of the Bible? Is it Ephesians or Philippians? There's some book that they...
Ephesians. Yeah, it's the homework. It's a next session. It's the reading. Yeah, Ephesians, and maybe that we have to recall the 10 things about that.
どうも?
It's good for us.
Is anybody else doing that? Okay. Ephesians is also talking about human living too.
Yeah, and maybe the biblical counseling suggested to read Ephesians because Ephesians maybe it's a lot of the changing the mind or the lifestyle or how to change the people and how impact the gospel impacts people's life. That's why we have to read the Ephesians for the evidence about the Bible impacts to human life.
Okay.
Instead of psychology. Ephesians, yeah, good.
Well, I mean, maybe we could do the prison letters.
Yeah.
That will solve.
Ephesians, Philippians, yeah, that's ideal for me.
I got to check and see how fast we can move. Because the biblical counseling next thing is like, is that in October?
Yeah. Yeah, October. The deadline October.
Okay. Sorry to keep you guys waiting. And our piano player can come every week, right? We miss your piano playing. Let's pray. Dear God, the same prayer I always have, that you would please bless the study, bless your word, and bless how it enters into our hearts and minds. Please do keep perfecting us and drawing us to yourself through your word and through your spirit. Please guide our thinking about what we should do next time, and I hope that the next study will really be great for everyone, maybe even including some more people that we can invite now that we're moving back into the New Testament. Please help everybody get home safely, and please bless everyone's work and study and the things that they do throughout the week until we're back here together again next week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.